I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. In his long speech to the Hebrew people before they enter the promised land, before they cross over, Moses says, in the words of God, Moses speaking for God says, "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity." Life and prosperity, death and adversity. Some of you may remember this reading from the King James Bible, where Moses says, "I have set before thee this day life and good, and death and evil." Those ring a little differently. What is the difference between prosperity and good? And what is the difference between adversity and evil? Well, the Hebrew words good and bad have this whole range of meanings, but so do the English words. You think about it. Good can mean just good in terms of quality, or good can mean a moral good. We can talk about a good piece of land. We're not saying anything moral about that piece of land. A good meal, or I wish you good, I wish you well. It can mean sort of prosperity, quality, goodness. But then there is the good that has a judgment in it. Glinda the good witch, as opposed to the wicked witch. Or the battle of good versus evil. Good in that sense is not just a judgment, or not just a personal judgment. It is an absolute. On the other hand, we can talk about bad as something that's just not all that it should be. A bad phone connection, a bad taste. She had a bad time of it. Just bad meaning difficult, meaning not as it should be. But there's also bad as evil. Remember the movie The Bad Seed? Or from the same movie, Are You a Good Witch or a Bad Witch? English and Hebrew, both of them, good and bad, have that range of meanings from the subjective, pleasant versus nasty, to the objective, righteous versus evil. They both have that in them, and I don't know, I can't get into Moses' head, but I think that both of those are there in this meaning. I think Moses means them both. There's a cliche in preaching, and if you have read as many online sermons as I have, you will realize what a cliche it is. I don't know who said it first. There are two kinds of law. There's the law of the land, which is more or less arbitrary and can be changed when people want to change it. And the prime example is a speed limit. Speed limit is set at 55. Well, until the energy crisis of the 70s, the speed limit on the highway was 70. But we decided that we were going to move it back to 55, and then when, a little bit later, when that felt too slow, we moved it up to 65. It's something that we can decide what is right and what is wrong, but as long as it is in effect, it is in effect, and it has the force of law. Another example would be a zoning regulation. A zoning regulation is something that is absolute until you appeal it. And if you appeal it with enough backup and enough reasons why, you can get a variance. Then the other kind of law is a law of nature, or what we might call a law of God, a cause and effect kind of law. It's just how things are. And this kind of law is self-enforcing. Obviously, gravity is the big one. If you violate the law of gravity, there is no one there to enforce that on you. There are no gravity cops to come out and give you a ticket. If you violate the law of gravity, you are punished by hitting your head on the ground. The second law of thermodynamics, if it is in fact an absolute law, is nothing that has to be enforced, and is nothing that we decide upon and vote upon. It just is. And then the preaching cliche in this is that we too often see God's commandments as the first kind of law, an arbitrary set of rules, when they're really the second kind of law, just the way the world is. If we think of God's law as a list of arbitrary rules, then the idea of rewarding or punishing based on those rules seems arbitrary as well. especially when the rules, at least as we've received them, seem pretty broad, and we're not entirely sure how they apply. I mean, honor your father and mother. Okay, well, does that mean that I have to take the phone call every time it comes in? Does that mean that I have to run to my parents' side every time they ask? Does that mean that I have to give up my life and prosperity to take care of them? People would answer yes or no to all of those, and it's not entirely clear. The idea that God is keeping track of merits and demerits, like the house points at Hogwarts, seems pretty petty. It seems unworthy of our God that he would be keeping score. This is how things work with gods like Baal and Moloch, idols who have to be appeased and truckled to. That's not the way our God works. But if God's law is of the other kind, the cause and effect kind of law, the self-enforcing kind of law, then it's closer to God educating us on the consequences of our actions. It's not as though God's saying, if you drop a heavy weight on your foot, I will punish you. God is saying, if you drop a heavy weight on your foot, it's going to hurt. If you don't change the oil in your car, it will break down. If you spend all your money on heroin, you won't have rent. We tend to be squeamish about the idea of God rewarding and punishing, but we feel a lot more comfortable, at least in my conversations with people, with the idea of consequences and accountability for our own actions. That makes sense to us. We can see how it works in the world, that if you do certain things, there will be certain consequences. Maybe not immediately, maybe not 100% of the time. We can always think of examples of people who have done incredibly stupid things and have come out on top. But it appeals to our rational, fair-minded mind to think that the law of the world is cause and effect. Between those two kinds of rules, between those two kinds of laws, what would we think about a parent who sits his child down at the age when the child can understand it, say at 7 or 8, and says, I've given you my rules, you got the memo, I gave you the list of all my rules, and if you obey them all, I will love you and feed you and protect you. If you break any of them, I will withhold those things. What kind of parent is that? What would we think instead of a parent who sat their child down and said, look, I love you, so let me save you some pain as you go forward. If you behave like this, you're more likely to be happy. If you behave like that, you're more likely to be miserable. I'm going to love you either way, but please try to make good choices. Now, this only goes so far. I think this is the kind of law that God is teaching us, but I think what God is doing is going beyond giving good advice. This is going beyond Dear Abby. God isn't just giving life tips. That's another preaching cliche. There's a whole style of preaching that starts from a scripture reading and then very quickly moves beyond it to advice on marriage or parenting or career advice, and you can always recognize them because the preacher usually ends with, these are the top 5 ways to improve your marriage. Or even better, sometimes it's an acronym. You can remember these 5 ways because they spell out LOVE. L is for, that's not what God is doing. God is not just sort of giving us good advice, giving us ways to remember how to get along. What is it that God is telling the Hebrews that they should do? If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. God isn't just giving good advice. God is saying, look, if you value our relationship, you, the people Israel, you, the chosen people, if you value that relationship that I've established with you, if you honor the covenant that we made here in the desert, that we made when you were in extremis, if you remember everything that I've taught you over the last 40 years, then things are going to go well for you in your new home. But if you abandon this relationship, if you forget everything I taught you, this just really isn't going to work very well. God doesn't say, quite pointedly, if you listen, God doesn't say, if you break these commandments, decrees, and ordinances, I will make life difficult for you. No, he says, if you break these commandments, then life will be difficult for you. God doesn't say, if you abandon me and run after other gods, I will abandon you and turn my back on you. No, God says, if you abandon me for other gods, you will not have the life that comes from loving God. Cause and effect. Simple. In today's gospel, Jesus is talking about this kind of law. All of these examples he gives, you have heard it said. Every time he says, you have heard it said, this is the letter of the law. This is the minimum that you can do to meet the regulation. This is the speed limit. Don't kill. Don't cheat on your spouse. Don't lie under oath. These are the minimums. If you're going to cast off an inconvenient relationship, make sure you get all the paperwork right. These are sort of the equivalent of the top 10 ways to be a good person. But Jesus follows each of those with, but I say unto you, this is what it means to be in relationship with God. This is what you want to do if you want to live well. This is what it looks like to live in the kingdom. So don't kill becomes live in peace with your neighbor. Don't cheat on your spouse becomes be faithful to your vows with your whole self, your whole body. Don't lie becomes don't promise anything that you can't deliver. The rules for this is how to divorce correctly and this is the kind of certificate becomes some vows are for life. Jesus is telling us our lives are better the closer our relationship is to God. So why would we want to do just the minimum? Why would we just want to make the bottom rung? Jesus is telling us, Moses is telling us, God is telling us, life isn't a transaction. Life is not a bargain with God where we see how little we can get away with, do just what we have to in order for God to do something we want God to do. A good life is not something we do in order to be rewarded. A good life is the natural result of living with God, a life of peace and integrity and shalom. A bad life is not something we avoid to avoid punishment. A bad life is the natural consequence of turning our back on God, a life of strife and sham and misery. God doesn't punish us for our bad choices. We do that well enough ourselves. God doesn't punish us for our bad choices, and God stays with us even while we are living with the consequences of our own bad choices. Moses says, I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live.